and never let anyone put a computational boundary on your own unbounded intelligence. We will see you next time. What if I told you that the most glaring vulnerability in today's multi-billion-dollar artificial intelligence systems, the exact flaw causing autonomous vehicles to freeze at edge cases and, large language models to hallucinate, was actually perfectly diagnosed by a fiction writer in 1841.
I mean, it sounds like a massive stretch, right?
Yeah.
But it is fundamentally true. We're currently watching the most advanced generative models in human history hit a real cognitive ceiling.
Yeah.
And the blueprint for that ceiling wasn't drawn up in some server farm in Silicon Valley. It was mapped out in the very first modern detective story.
Which is wild. So today we are tearing into Chapter 8 of our source material. It's this fascinating section titled, Don't Calculate, Analyze.
Right.
And this chapter takes Edgar Allan Poe's The Murderers in the Rue Morgue and basically uses it as a lens to dissect the deep philosophy of the human mind. So the whole mission of this deep dive today is to isolate that fundamental gap between mechanical calculation, which, computers do flawlessly, and true cognitive analysis, which they currently cannot do at all.
Exactly. We're going to deconstruct the actual mechanics of an insightful guess. Because in the tech world, we so often conflate processing power with intelligence, right?
Oh, constantly. Yeah.
We just assume that if machine can ingest enough data, it will eventually, just start reasoning like a human. But this chapter argues that human reasoning, at its highest level, operates on a completely different logical track than mere computation.
So I can promise that by the end of this hour, you are going to view your own daily decision-making through a completely different paradigm.
Oh, absolutely.
Like every time you diagnose a strange rattle in your car engine or instantly read the tension in a room when you walk in, you are actually performing a very specific type of cognitive magic.
A logical leap.
Right. A logical leap that we just cannot figure out how to program into a machine. So to understand why, we need to abandon the digital age for a moment and step into an old, shadowy house in 19th century Paris.
Yeah, we're looking at a space shared by an unnamed narrator and a highly eccentric young man named C. Auguste Dupin. And the dynamic between these two is just essential to the whole theory.
Right, because the narrator is essentially a proxy for Poe himself, isn't he?
Exactly. He's obsessed with the mechanics of thought. He's watching Dupin not just as a roommate or a friend, but as a living laboratory of human cognition.
Yeah, the text actually describes Dupin as a strange and interesting young fellow who has lost his family wealth and slipped into near poverty, which is a state he apparently barely even registers.
He doesn't care at all. He is entirely consumed by his own internal world.
But it's their routine that really stands out to me. I mean, they spend their days in a darkened house with the shutters completely closed, just waiting for what they call the advent of the true darkness.
It's very gothic.
Very. And then they just roam the streets of Paris, arm in arm, seeking, and this is a quote, the infinity of mental excitement which quiet observation can afford.
And that isolation is actually a deliberate epistemological choice. The source material really emphasizes this stark contrast between Dupin and the official Parisian police force.
Right.
The police are described as possessing simple diligence and activity. So, in modern terms, the police are acting like a good old-fashioned AI.
Like a deterministic rules engine from the 80s.
Exactly. They are executing a brute force search. They measure footprints, they interrogate witnesses, they catalog physical items.
Okay, but let's unpack this for a second, because I want to challenge the necessity of that isolation. Is the author implying that to possess true originality or, peculiar analytic ability, you have to literally detach yourself from society?
It's a fair question.
Like, why can't a highly integrated parallel processing system or just a well-adjusted human being engage in this level of quiet observation? Why the darkness?
Well, it really comes down to prior probabilities and societal conditioning. When you're deeply embedded in standard societal routines, your cognitive model of the world relies heavily on expected outcomes, just to save energy.
Okay, sure. Like heuristics.
Exactly. You hear breaking glass, you infer a break-in. You see a footprint, you infer a shoe. You're constantly applying high-probability heuristics.
So by retreating to the true darkness and observing the city as a detached outsider,
Dupin is intentionally lowering the weight of those societal priors. He's trying to prevent his brain from automatically jumping to the most statistically likely conclusion.
Oh, wow. Because true analysis often requires recognizing when the most likely conclusion is entirely wrong.
Precisely. He is essentially unbiasing his own neural network. He needs a blank slate to run an open-ended causal analysis.
That makes so much sense. And the author provides the absolute perfect test case for this, right? A scenario where all the high probability heuristics just completely fail. The murders in the Rue Morgue.
The physical details of this crime scene are so crucial here. They represent the raw data that will eventually crash the algorithm of the police's logic.
Right.
If we treat the Paris police as a standard machine learning model, this crime scene is an adversarial attack perfectly designed to break their classification systems.
Okay, let's lay out the data for everyone listening. The narrator reads a report in the Gazette des Tribunaux. It's 3 a.m. in the Quartier Saint-Roch. The whole neighborhood wakes up to this succession of terrifying shrieks from the fourth story of Madame L'Espanaye's house.
And the neighbors and two gendarmes, they force the gateway open with a crowbar.
Right, and as they run up the stairs, they hear two voices in angry contention. But by the time they reach the fourth floor, there's just silence. The door to the back chamber is locked from the inside with the key still in the lock.
The classic locked room mystery.
The very first ones. They force it open, and the spectacle inside is just pure chaos. It's an epistemological nightmare.
We have a bed thrown into the middle of the room, a razor on a chair covered in blood, thick tresses of gray human hair on the hearth, just violently ripped out by the roots.
It's horrific. And then we encounter the variables that actively contradict standard human motives.
Yes, the valuables.
Right, the valuables. There are 4 Napoleons, a topaz earring, silver spoons, and 2 bags containing nearly 4,000 francs in gold just sitting right there on the floor, entirely untouched.
And an iron safe under the bed is open with the key still in the lock, but it only contains old, worthless letters. Now, the text notes that the mother had actually withdrawn a large quantity of gold 3 days prior.
So, if you're running a standard predictive model for a violent home invasion,
Your highest weighted note is robbery.
obviously.
Yeah.
But the state of the room totally invalidates that hypothesis. A human agent does not execute a complex, incredibly violent break-in, go to the trouble of opening a safe, and then just abandon 4,000 francs in plain sight.
It doesn't compute. It's not just missing data, it's actively corrupted data.
Yeah.
And the physical evidence is just as contradictory. They find the daughter, Camille, shoved head downward up the narrow aperture of the chimney.
Ugh. And the text describes severe scratches from being thrust up the rough brick and deep fingernail indentations on her throat, indicating she was throttled.
And Madame L'Espanaye is found in the paved yard in the rear. Her throat is cut so deeply that her head actually falls off when they try to lift her.
And her body is fearfully mutilated. So the sheer physical force required here is superhuman. Wedging an adult human body up a chimney defies the standard parameters of human strength.
Completely.
Like, if I'm trying to parse this data set, whether I'm an investigator or an AI, the inputs just don't compute. You have a killer who takes the time to open a safe, but ignores the gold, possesses the strength of a hydraulic press, and somehow vanishes from a room that's locked from the inside.
You are identifying the exact point where a system relying solely on precedent fails. The police are searching their mental database. They're trying to map this incoming data to historical clusters.
Right. They know that forced entry plus an open safe usually equals a burglary.
But when they try to integrate the untouched gold and the body in the chimney, the loss function of their model just explodes. It cannot reconcile the data.
And the auditory evidence completely shatters whatever logic they have left. Because the next day, the Gazette publishes the witness testimonies regarding those 2 voices on the stairs.
This is where we really see the limitations of rigid data processing in real time.
Yeah, all the witnesses agree on one voice. It was a gruff, French-speaking man. They heard words like sacré and diable. So that variable is stable.
But the second voice creates a total systemic failure. The consensus completely disintegrates.
It's hilarious, honestly. One policeman calls it hard, high, and very strange, guessing it's Spanish. Another witness thinks it's Italian. Another guesses Russian. Another says English.
But the crucial detail, the thing that breaks the system, is that not a single witness, regardless of what language they guessed, could understand a single word.
Right. A French witness thought it was Spanish, but didn't actually speak Spanish. To everyone, it sounded like pure gibberish.
So the police are gathering more data, right?
Yeah.
But that data is increasing the entropy of the system rather than resolving it.
That's a great point.
In a closed, rule-based logic system, more data should narrow the search space. You eliminate possibilities until you isolate the truth. But here, the extra data pushes them further from any coherent conclusion.
It really reminds me of how a large language model behaves when it's fed out of distribution data.
Oh, yes.
Like, if you prompt an LLM with a scenario that exists completely outside its training weights, it doesn't just admit ignorance, it hallucinates.
It confidently gives you a wrong answer.
Exactly. It forces the anomalous data into a known framework, generating a highly confident, entirely fabricated response. The witnesses are doing the exact same thing. They hear an acoustic pattern they don't recognize, and their brains forcibly map it to the nearest foreign language they don't speak.
That is a precise analogy. They are interpolating between known vectors, and the police are doing this on a macro level with the whole case.
Yeah.
Because a crime like this has never occurred in their historical training data, they simply cannot process a gibberish voice alongside untouched gold and superhuman strength. Their model crashes, and they resort to the equivalent of an algorithmic hallucination.
Which is arresting the poor bank clerk.
Exactly. They arrest a bank clerk just because he handed over the gold 3 days prior.
It's a desperate attempt to force causality where none exists. They're clinging to the only known the money, even though the physical state of the room literally proves the money wasn't the motive.
So the brute force model has failed. And enter Dupin.
Enter Dupin. He reads the Gazette, gains permission to view the intact crime scene, and applies his peculiar analysis.
He examines the room, he processes the exact same data the police did. But instead of generating a human suspect, he goes and places an advertisement in a shipping journal.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting. He writes an ad stating that a very large tawny orangutan of the Bornese species has been found, and asks the owner, the sailor from a Maltese vessel, to come claim it.
He arrives at a solution that seems, at first glance, entirely disconnected from the domain of the problem. He concludes the killer was not human at all. It was a wild orangutan brought to Paris by a sailor.
But when you apply that solution back to the data, the causal graph instantly resolves itself.
It snaps into place.
Exactly. The superhuman strength needed to force a body up a chimney, explained by the musculature of a great ape.
The agility required to scale the outside of the building and swing through a fourth-story window on a shutter. The natural biomechanics of a tree-dwelling primate.
The untouched gold. An animal has no concept of currency. It has absolutely zero economic motive.
And the horrific, seemingly random violence. The text explains the orangutan had watched its owner shaving, escaped with a straight-edge razor, and when it swung into the women's room, the screaming terrified it.
It began wildly imitating the shading motion it had observed.
Right, resulting in the fatal wound to the mother. Panicking, it tried to hide the bodies, shoving one up the chimney and throwing the other out the window.
And the auditory data, this is the best part. The gruff French voice was the horrified sailor who had tracked his escaped animal to the Rue Morgue and watched the carnage through the window, completely unable to stop it.
And that high, hard, strange, gibberish voice that no one could identify.
It wasn't Russian or Italian. It was the screeching of a panicked ape.
See, Dupin did not ignore the contradictory data points. He realized they were only contradictory because of a flawed foundational constraint.
The assumption that the killer was human.
Exactly. The police operated with a hard-coded prior. The perpetrator is a human being. Under that constraint, the data is physically impossible.
Oh, yeah.
But by dropping that single assumption, Dupin allows the probabilities to realign into a completely novel, contradiction-free framework.
Okay, I have a serious point of contention here, though.
Let's hear it.
The author explicitly writes, in truth, Dupin just guessed. But wait, the police guessed too. They guessed it was the bank clerk. Why is Dupin's guess celebrated as a triumph of analytic genius, while the police's guess is dismissed as a systemic failure?
It's a valid question.
I mean, if you drop the constraint of a human killer, you open the search space to literal infinity. Why an orangutan? Why not a demon or a bear or some steampunk machine? Isn't he just randomly pulling from a wider set of variables?
It is not a random search, though, and this distinction is actually the core philosophical argument of the entire chapter.
Okay.
To understand why Dupin's inference is structural and not random, we have to examine the essay Poe places at the very beginning of the story. Before the narrative even begins, he draws a hard epistemological line between calculation and analysis.
Right, the nonfiction prologue. He defines calculation as connecting known dots, applying preset rules, like if you know the axioms of algebra, you can calculate the result of an equation. The path is predetermined by the rules of the system.
Yes. Calculation operates strictly within a closed system. Think of a chessboard.
Okay, a chessboard.
The parameters are absolute. There are 64 squares. The movement vectors of a knight never ever change. A machine can calculate every possible permutation within that closed universe. Analysis, however, requires an open system.
Analysis is the act of making sense of the dots in the first place. It is the leap that generates the framework itself. Poe actually argues that calculation is a lower-order cognitive function.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah, he says it's only utilized after the analytical insight has occurred, just to test if the leap holds up against physical reality.
Right, so Dupin has the analytical insight. The perpetrator is a non-human primate, and only then does he use calculation to verify it. Does an ape have the requisite strength? Yes. Do the hair samples found at the scene match a human? No. He uses deductive calculation to test the analytical hypothesis.
It's like the difference between doing a math worksheet, which is calculation, and inventing a completely new type of math to solve a physics problem. You can teach someone the rules of algebra. But how do you teach someone how to have a leap of insight?
You can't. And Poe admits this analytical leap is deeply mysterious. He writes that the analytical features of the mind are but little susceptible to analysis.
Very meta.
He essentially says, I know this cognitive leap exists, I can write a character who executes it, but I cannot tell you the mechanical rules of how it actually happens.
He hit the limit of 19th century psychology. He recognized that skill is evinced in matters beyond the limits of mere rule.
Because you cannot invent a new field of mathematics into a procedural syllabus. It doesn't work.
Right, and this is where we pivot from literature to formal logic. Because decades later, someone read this exact detective story and decided that Poe's mysterious leap of insight wasn't magic at all. It was a definable logical structure.
Yes, this is where we bring in Charles Sanders Peirce.
Peirce is a titan of American philosophy and logic in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And he's reading The Murders in the Rue Morgue, and he is captivated by Dupin.
But unlike Poe, who is perfectly comfortable leaving the genesis of the guess as an unsolvable mystery, Peirce wanted to decode the formal architecture of human reasoning.
He rejected the idea that human thinking is fundamentally calculative. He looked at the real world and saw that nothing is absolute lucent. The real world is not a chessboard.
No, it's a massive, open-ended, extremely noisy environment. We are constantly piecing fragmentary data together, formulating explanations, and then revising them.
And at the time Peirce was writing, classical logic largely recognized two dominant modes of reasoning, right? Deduction and induction.
Yes, and Peirce understood that neither of these could account for Dupin's orangutan hypothesis, nor could they account for the process of scientific discovery itself.
So we don't need to spend too much time defining basic Aristotelian deduction, but we should clarify how Peirce viewed them in this context.
Okay, so deduction extracts the consequences of what is already known. It is safe, top-down logic. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal.
Right. And induction classifies existing data based on frequency. It is bottom-up pattern recognition. Like I've seen 1,000 swans and they were all white, so I induce that all swans are white.
Exactly. But neither operation can generate a fundamentally new idea.
That's the kicker. You cannot deduce the orangutan from a pre-existing rule because there is literally no generalized rule stating when bodies are found in chimneys, seek an ape.
And you cannot induce it from repeated observations because a crime like this had never been observed before in the history of Paris.
So both deduction and induction are calculative. They operate entirely within the boundaries of the existing data set.
Precisely. So Peirce introduced a third logical category to capture the art of the guess. He formalized it as abduction.
Abduction. Okay, so what is the formal structure of that?
Abduction is the logical process of forming an explanatory hypothesis. Peirce structured it quite elegantly. First, a surprising fact, or a set of surprising facts, is observed. We'll call that C.
Okay, fact C.
Second, you generate a hypothesis, A. The defining characteristic of hypothesis A is that if it were true, C would be a matter of course. It would perfectly explain it.
So therefore, there is reason to suspect that A is true.
Exactly. That is the formal logical structure of a guess.
Let's map Dupin's logic directly onto Peirce's structure of abduction then. The surprising facts C are the gibberish voice, the superhuman strength, the tufts of coarse non-human hair, and the abandoned gold.
Right. All the data that broke the police's model.
So Dupin generates hypothesis A. An escaped wild orangutan committed the act. Now, if A is true, if an ape was in the room, then C, all those bizarre, contradictory facts would perfectly and naturally make sense.
They become a matter of course.
Therefore, by the logic of abduction, there is valid reason to suspect an orangutan.
Notice the epistemological humility in Peirce's formulation, though. Abduction does not prove that the orangutan is guilty. It merely legitimizes the hypothesis for further testing.
It provides a formal, logical justification for stepping entirely outside the established data set to introduce a novel causal mechanism.
Yes. Abduction is the only logical operation that introduces anything genuinely new into a system.
It's working backwards from surprise to cause. And this completely answers my earlier challenge about why Dupin's guess isn't just random flailing.
How so?
Well, the police's guess, the bank clerk, doesn't satisfy Pierce's formula. If the bank clerk committed the murder, it does not make the superhuman strength or the gibberish voice a matter of course. The hypothesis doesn't explain the surprise. Dupin's hypothesis explains everything.
Exactly. The genius of Pierce is that he took the most elusive aspect of human cognition, that aha moment, the spark of scientific paradigm shifts, and he proved it has a rigorous logical structure. It's not mysticism, it is abduction.
But this brings us to a massive, glaring contradiction. If Pierce successfully captured this guessing process in a formal logical structure, doesn't that imply it can be algorithmic? And if we have the logical architecture for abduction, why are our current multi-billion-dollar AI systems slamming into a wall when trying to perform it?
Because diagnosing the logical structure of a cognitive leap is entirely different from rendering it computationally tractable.
Okay, elaborate on that.
Pierce laid out the formal logic of human thought long before digital computers existed. But in doing so, he unwittingly diagnosed the exact boundary condition of modern artificial intelligence.
Let's bring this back to the grand AI dilemma we started the show with. We have engineered the most powerful digital processing networks in human history. But at their core, they are still just the ultimate calculating machines.
They are the Paris police, scaled up to planetary dimensions. They possess infinite, flawless diligence and activity.
We know exactly how to program deduction. An expert system can run through 1 billion logical syllogisms in a microsecond. And over the last decade, we have definitely mastered programming induction.
Which is the entire foundation of deep learning and neural networks.
Right. We feed a model millions of parameters, and it induces the statistical distribution of the data. A large language model calculates the probabilistic sequence of tokens.
But the architecture of neural networks is fundamentally inductive. They are interpolating within the high-dimensional space of their training data. When they encounter an edge case in the real world, an open system, where variables interact in unprecedented ways, they simply cannot perform abduction.
They cannot generate a hypothesis that exists outside their latent space. Like, an AI can parse the data of the Rue Morgue and output the statistical probability of a robbery. It can sort the witness statements by linguistic frequency.
But it cannot make the abductive leap to Maltese orangutan.
Because to formulate that hypothesis, you need a causal model of the physical world. You have to understand gravity, the mechanics of a chimney, the behavior of frightened animals, and the concept of economic value.
You're hitting on the absolute crux of the issue here. Causal reasoning versus correlation. AI systems map correlations incredibly well. But abduction requires understanding causality in an open system.
Right.
It requires the ability to ask counterfactual questions, like, what would the world look like if this foundational assumption were false? Current generative models do not have an underlying world model. They have a statistical map of language.
So they cannot sit in the dark, drop their priors, and synthesize a novel framework.
No. The combinatorial explosion of generating novel hypotheses in an open world is computationally intractable for a machine that relies on brute force calculation. You just can't program an open system into a closed loop.
So we are trying to build artificial intelligence, but we are actually just perfecting artificial calculators.
And this is exactly why, when an autonomous vehicle encounters a completely novel obstruction on the road, something that doesn't cleanly map to a pedestrian, vehicle, or debris, it often freezes or makes a catastrophic error.
It can't abduce a new category on the fly.
It completely lacks the peculiar analytic ability of Auguste Dupin.
Wow. We have spent an hour unraveling a mystery from 1841 to explain the limitations of the technology defining our future.
It's been a journey.
We started with the locked room and the broken data set of the Rue Morgue. We analyzed how Dupin discarded the flawed constraints of the police to make a brilliantly structured abductive leap.
Yes, and we explored Poe's distinction between the closed system of calculation and the open system of analysis.
And finally, We looked at Charles Sanders Peirce's formalization of abduction, showing us exactly what our neural networks are missing.
Which means the underlying logic of human insight is not a matter of processing speed or the sheer volume of data.
No.
It is the ability to navigate an open, chaotic universe, encounter something entirely surprising, and dynamically construct a new reality that perfectly explains it.
Which means that for you, listening to this, every time you use that cognitive machinery, every time you look at a confusing spreadsheet and suddenly realize the foundational premise of the project is wrong, or every time you hear a strange noise in the house and correctly abduce that it's just the thermal expansion of the floorboards, you are actually executing a logical miracle.
You really are. You are performing an abductive leap that the most advanced server farms on Earth cannot replicate. Your mind is an analyst, operating in an open system. The human brain is comfortable in the true darkness, navigating the unknown without a pre-existing map.
Which leaves us with a lingering, provocative thought to take away. If the essence of human intelligence, the trait that elevates us above incredibly fast, rule-following machines, is our innate capacity to make a creative, unprogrammed, abductive guess, then what happens if the engineers eventually solve this?
That is the billion-dollar question.
Right, if someone, someday, writes an architecture that allows a machine to natively construct its own causal world models and perform true abduction,